You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone in 3D. Here we go. All right, I'm gonna try to do the straight-faced intro on this as best as I can.
Compose yourself, Bernie. I know it's a highly charged, emotional episode we're about to embark on.
I'm gonna try. All right, so you're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of the hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, co-host extraordinaire, unfortunately in 2D, but we're talking about a 3D movie, Pete Charbonneau. Pete, how's it going?
Great, Bernie. Just got back from the Forbidden Zone myself, and feeling like a scav right now. I feel like I've put in some time, and I'm ready to talk.
With us today is also John Zemsky. John, co-host of the So Bad It's podcast, joining us to talk about a movie that I don't want to say holds a special place in any of our respective hearts, but we watched it, so we've got to talk about it. So thank you, John, for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me in 3D discussing a film that was a 1D film.
There you go. A little bit of a teaser there. So
maybe D minus.
There you go. That's right. Context. The three of us grew up in the 80s with like really good 3D movies. And there was like the big 3D craze, right? In the 80s, like Friday the 13th Part 3, Jaws 3D, Amityville, cult classics like 1961's The Mask, Parasite, 1982 movie by Charles Band, Treasure of the Four Crowns. It's kind of like Canon Films, Raiders of the Lost Ark ripoff movie in 1983. There was the 1955 Revenge of the Creature that was released in summer 1982. That's when we remember it because we were going to 7-Eleven or Pizza Hut to get our 3D glasses and watch it in a nationwide 3D event. So you guys were watching it on Long Island. I was watching it in Chicago, and we were all just disappointed because it was not as good as we were hoping it would be. There was the resurgence of 3D movies in the early aughts when we saw movies like My Bloody Valentine 3D, Piranha 3D, Jurassic World, and then recently you get Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But no, we're not talking about any of those movies. We devoted an entire episode to Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. And we're going to close the loop on this 80s sci-fi extravaganza with, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about the Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone.
The first quality 3D film backed by a major studio. The first to use a new state-of-the-art 3D process. This is Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. It's the story of three unlikely heroes. Their destination, the Forbidden Zone. Their mission, save three stranded women.
I like her.
Their chances, 1 in a million.
I'll take that bet.
Columbia Pictures presents outer space as you've never seen it before. The ultimate 3D experience.
Can't anything be simple anymore?
Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. In 3D, the first movie that puts you in outer space. Rated PG. Coming soon to a theater near you.
Is that what I watched?
I hope so, John. And if you didn't, then you might be the luckiest one of the three of us right now.
You win a prize, and that prize is your dignity.
Now, the thing, John, that you missed out on is Pete and I went on Pete, it was over an hour discussion on Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. That movie was a bit of a rough watch, but in hindsight, it was actually a really fun watch, and it was fun to talk about it with you, Pete. I think Spacehunter may not be nearly as fun to talk about as Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn was, because that's the thing we learned about Metalstorm. You have to say the whole title.
Yes, and I don't think Spacehunter falls in the same category. We're not contractually obliged to say Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone every time. I think if you just want to call it Spacehunter, that's good by me. Of course, Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn is a different story, and that you do have to say the entire name of the film. I think it's been codified by law by the latest Congress. One of the resolutions that kind of flew under the radar with everything else going on, but it is now the law of the land. So please, don't break the law. Let's all be law-abiding citizens and just call Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn.
Now, John, you're a card-carrying member of the Nostalgia Club, just like Pete and myself. You grew up with Goonies and Raiders and Star Wars, just like us. So some of these movies that we enjoyed watching, like, we've revisited. dozens of times versus movies like Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn. Not so much, but they have that cult classic status. I have to imagine that Spacehunter was in the category of I didn't know this existed for you. Like, have you seen this movie before this?
No, when Pete brought up the idea of actually watching this and mentioned that Molly Ringwald and some other A-list actors were in it, I was just sitting there racking my brain. Do I recall this at all? And I really did not recall any of it. So I definitely had not seen it, and I don't think I'd ever heard of it. And I know we'll talk about this, but it was quite interesting to me how close to that Molly Ringwald was so close to her prime run in movies at the time. This was very close.
Oh, that's a good point. So when we were talking about Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn, Pete, we talked about how it was, like another Star Wars clone. So Star Wars comes out in 1977, and you get all the wannabes, everything from Battlestar Galactica on TV, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars, Ice Pirates, Space Mutiny, and Spacehunter is still like in that world of the space opera Western, and it even has some like post-apocalyptic Mad Max type aesthetics to it as well. And maybe I'm giving it more credit than I should, but it feels like it's in that crowd.
Yeah, especially with the their use of vehicles, definitely. Because I had mentioned the Mad Max thing as well, not necessarily story-wise, but just, I guess, some of the vehicles and I'll say battles, but I don't think that doesn't even really, I don't know that you can use the term battles for this film.
I think the battle was like our inner battle of trying to actually keep watching it. That was the battle that was going on.
Well, and you guys know that I love movies that are so bad they're good, and yes. I would actually. So I will say this as a spoiler that this one did enter into the so bad it's good for me.
It did. Okay, all right. We're gonna have to get into that because you guys coined the phrase that I now lovingly use, that earnest awfulness, and I think that's a really good way of describing a movie that for some people may be awful. I mean, and I think that's where, we talk about like guilty pleasures, and, then there's also there is no guilty pleasure. Like, you like what you like and, celebrate what you want. But there are ways where like the production value to this, Pete, compared to Metalstorm, to Destruction of Jared-Syn, like the production for Spacehunter is higher. You can see it on the screen.
Yeah, well, I think Columbia Pictures released this. This was a major release. I believe that they rushed to get this out like a week ahead of Return of the Jedi. Like that was, which could explain. I think they were looking to get a jump on that, on the Oscar buzz for special effects and acting. So they were like, we got to get this into theaters as quickly as.
I saw Ivan Reitman's name come up was he producer of this?
He produced it, yeah. And when you think about him, we think about like those 80s staples like Ghostbusters and Meatballs, and to think that he was attached to this as well. Yeah, that was a surprising name in the credits, John, that when it popped up, again, and I saw this, I think, in passing growing up, but it didn't have like the stickiness to it that some other, like Flight of the Navigator or Last Starfighter. Those are movies that I may not revisit as often, but they have a special place in my heart. John, first time that you saw it was literally maybe a few days ago for this podcast. I think I saw this back in the 80s, and again, completely forgot it. Pete, do you remember the first time that you saw Spacehunter?
Well, let me tell you a little story. I hit the exacta with Spacehunter and Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn, because I saw both of these in the theater, first run.
Oh, man.
This is true. I don't know if that gives me any cred or takes cred away from me. I feel like I just happen to be of age to have been in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the right time. But so this was released May 23rd, 1983, Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn. 3 months later, August 19th, 1983. So 1983 was a real banner year for my 3D sci-fi movie-going experience. And I remember very little of this movie. So rewatching it, I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. So, I saw this at the Smithtown Theater where John and I grew up on Main Street, Smithtown, Long Island, New York. I definitely remember that. I can remember being in the theater for this. There are like snippets of things that I remember, like, Michael Ironside's character, who we'll get into that contraption. And I don't know if I'm sure I was watching Facts of Life at that point, so I probably knew who Molly Ringwald was, but I don't know if I necessarily made the connection because I was still like 11 years old or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember how long the refund line was after the movie?
This could be a false memory, but I recall my dad took me to see this, and it was not, the theater was not full. I can tell you that.
I have to imagine, though, as a kid in 1983, Pete, this checks a lot of boxes for movies that the three of us would have loved, right? You have the Han Solo type character in Peter Strauss, Overdog, played by Michael Ironside, that just looks cool. Do you guys remember when Ghostbusters, the original, was released?
Probably a year or two later, 84 maybe.
Okay, so Ernie Hudson was not Winston yet for us, but again, the production value, it looks like a movie where they put some money on the screen, you throw in the 3D effects on top of it. So in some ways, Pete, I can't blame a young Pete for this because, this would have been a movie that should have gotten the three of us to a theater. Fortunately, John, for you and me, it only took Pete as its victim back in the day.
Well, and Pete has, I wouldn't say he's like a photographic memory, but Pete does not forget almost anything. So if he's like watching this movie and he's like, I only vaguely recall some scene, that's not a good sign.
It's not quite sepia tone, but there are like filters on this movie that are kind of like orange to give it like that otherworldly feel. Like that color palette, that stayed with me. Like I definitely remember that kind of like orange soaked world thing. But, it's interesting that you said that, Bernie, about like being in the wheelhouse, because I did more thinking about this than I probably should have, but I did do some thinking about exactly why. Because yes, like I remember being psyched for this and Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. We talked about why I felt ripped off at the end of Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. And if anyone would like to revisit that, they can check out that episode. But like it may be difficult for people of a certain generation to understand, like when we were coming of age, seeing a movie like this, which you can watch it now. And yes, this production values for the time, not bad, but still like some pretty cheap sets and cheap effects and things like that. But that kind of stuff, I don't recall ever really bothering me as a kid because we grew up watching a lot of like 50s and 60s sci-fi on TV where you could see the strings of the rocket going across the moon. Like it wasn't that hard for us to suspend our disbelief watching this stuff. So, shout out to Gen X, but we were kind of straddling this line of technology where yes, this stuff looks super cheap. 2001 like comes on the scene and just like blows away everything that came before it in terms of, effects. And it was just like, oh my God, this is what we can do. But that stuff didn't bother us. But like the thing that I kept going back to was you see these movies like Spacehunter in the theater, and at the end of the day, like when I'm going into the woods across the street with my friends, we're still going back to playing Star Wars. So, there's still something to like the storytelling and the vision of someone like George Lucas at the time and the next level special effects that captured obviously generations of people. And that was us playing that day in and day out. Like I was not playing Spacehunter after this movie. I can tell you that.
To be fair, Pete, I don't know where you would jump in. I was really nervous to be on this podcast tonight because I thought you guys might put one over on me and say, all right, John, what do you think this movie was about? Go. Because I honestly was sweating a little bit watching it. We watched it in a small group and we chatted over Discord and we could not stop laughing, which is never a good sign when it is, not entirely a comedy. But I really do not understand exactly what I watched.
Just for those people that have not seen this before, and quite
there
frankly,
should be a lot of them, Peter.
There are a lot of them.
Can someone give me like
does anyone want to take a stab at like the overall story of this movie? There are exposition dumps, and then there's like this is like the opposite of an exposition dump. Like there's stuff happening, there are scenes going on, like, but you don't quite know what's happening. I'll take a stab. Please. So we open up, it looks like some like luxury space cruise line is attacked and an escape pod lands on a planet. 3, you think, beings get out of it. It ends up being like 3 women who are quickly apprehended. Then you cut to our hero, played by Peter Strauss, Wolf. You don't know his name is Wolf until about 2/3 into the movie, I think.
Two Fs, mind you.
2 Fs. And he's kind of hanging out on his, beater of a spaceship. He's got like holes in his socks kicked up on the dashboard. And he appears to have a female co-pilot that he wakes up and gets like a distress signal about these women have been apprehended. And I guess he's kind of like a mercenary, I'm going to go track these women down and get paid for it type thing. There's a hint of there was a war at some point, that he's a veteran of some war, maybe.
Yes, because they do throw out there that in 2021, there was a plague outbreak. They mentioned something called Space Command. They talk about mega credits in that scene that you're talking about, Pete, where mega credits where Wolf is talking to Chalmers, his engineer slash. You get the sense that there's a pleasure robot kind of thing going on there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like, there's like this feeling of there's some war happened, like you mentioned, Pete, not to hijack your description, but there's an attempt at like infrastructure and like bureaucracy. Because at some point, voiced by Harold Ramis, I did look up some trivia on the movie.
Saw that in the credits. I was like,
he was the voice, and that's an Ivan Reitman connection. That
makes sense. Yeah, right. But he's the voice that pops in and tells our protagonist Wolf that his ex-wife is like he's late on some payments to his ex-wife, and he has some unpaid parking tickets. So sorry, Pete, I don't want to derail your
this all went completely over my head. I think I was laughing too loud.
I rewatched the first 10 minutes, and I heard the unpaid parking tickets line.
Yes. Pete, Wolf, please continue.
Be my friend. So Wolf and Chalmers take off to this planet that is apparently like very dangerous. Like, but we got a chance to make some money. So they land, they get out, he gets out his space buggy rover, a little bit better than the one driven by like Dojin from Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. And then they happen upon like this. It's something out of Ice, like it reminded me of Ice Pirates, like immediately.
Oh, good call. Yes.
Like a train, but on rails, but then there are like these giant like sails on it. It gets attacked. They get involved somehow, some way. You don't know why he picks a side, but he does. And then the women get kidnapped and flown off by a bunch of dudes in hang gliders. And so then Wolf's like, I guess I got to track him. But like, he's on this planet. Then he starts running into, various other colorful characters such as Molly Ringwald and Ernie Hudson, who he apparently was in the war with. Maybe like they're kind of rivals, but maybe they were part of the same faction. I don't know. Who cares? Doesn't matter.
You're using an appropriate amount of maybes, Pete. I just want to cheer you on here.
So now they're trying to track these women that have been kidnapped. They eventually arrive at some base, lair, city, spaceport, whatever you want to call it, where there's like a really creepy guy. Like this was tripping John when we were watching him. He's got like a weird accent. He's super pervy and is talking about like if the women have all their own limbs and things like that. And so like you're right. I'm like, all right, well, this guy's is definitely a bit of a creep. And then it cuts back and forth of Peter Strauss. Wolf meets up Molly Ringwald, who's like a scavenger, and tells him, I know how to find the women. I'll be your tracker type thing. So they form like they're butting heads, but begrudgingly takes her on. So basically they're trying to find where these women were taken to. No joke. Halfway through the movie, you get introduced to Michael Ironside's character for the first time. Like there's no, and this is the main bad guy. So of course, there's again, great storytelling going on here. Like you're really now invested in what's going to happen. I already feel like I'm taking up way too much time talking about like the story of this because there's not much one to be told. So so they eventually meet at this spaceport overlord, overdog, underdog, underdone, underdeveloped spot where it's basically like an episode of like Guts, Nickelodeon Guts and American Gladiators, where you have to like run through this maze of flames and sharp objects and shit like that. And of course, Molly Ringwald ends up in that. She has to run through it. Overdog takes a shine to her, and maybe do some more pervy things with her. But, finally Wolf comes in after basically observing all this stuff happening, saves the day. They fly off to happily ever ending, maybe. There's other stuff that happens, but none of it's really important. And
so my take is Han Solo wannabe, who definitely needs to do some wash. He's got his, the dirty socks going. You don't know at the time that his co-captain is a cyborg, and he's got the obvious, it's overt, like, sexual relationship with her. So there's a few themes that I want to bring up because some of them were funny, and some of them were extremely uncomfortable for me. And like the funny part. So I went back and rewatched the first 10 minutes because we were like just kind of talking and joking around as we were watching. And I heard a little bit of the shtick about like the parking tickets and stuff like that. Because I was like, I didn't quite get where the comedy came into this film and where the action, and you're supposed to take certain things serious because the quote unquote bad guys are real sinister and gross and despicable. So it like has that feel of, you're really supposed to take this seriously. But they start off the movie with some shtick and with his socks and the whole thing. And then, every time Ernie Hudson shows up in this movie, it turns into some like weird shtick back in the war. And I'm going to take your gun and throw it in the water. But yet they're like sort of like wink, wink, best buddies. It just made no sense to me. Like either you're pseudo best buddies and you did serve together, or you're completely on the outs. And they did in my opinion, a terrible job of writing that quote unquote companionship between these two.
And I found that, John, the original director was fired after 2 weeks of production on the movie.
2 weeks.
And if you go
by Wikipedia, his parking tickets either.
I would just have to say I was surprised at how deep the Wikipedia entry was for this movie, because I did not expect it. I thought it would be very cursory, very lean, but there was discussion about Ernie Hudson talking about when they brought in the second director, who's then credited on the film, Lamont Johnson. And I guess this was a bit of a stretch for him. He had directed episodes of like Twilight Zone and mostly like TV action and drama. But this was a stretch for him on the production scale. But he kind of threw out the tone of the original script, where I guess Wolf's character, that, mind you, was actually supposed to be played by Jeff Bridges. Just another piece of trivia. But the tone for Wolf was supposed to be more serious. Totally agree with you, John. Like, this movie is like this weird mishmash of, it doesn't know what it is, but at times, especially with the villains, they're certainly sinister. And Pete, you mentioned creepy. The original title for this was Adventures in the Creep Zone. And Overdog's character, played by Michael Ironside, his actual first name was Lord Creep, and then they changed it to Overdog. So
did you call him Iron Michael Ironside?
Iron Mike Tyson. Iron Mike Tyson size.
I don't want to besmirch the reputation of Michael Ironside, the man who played one of the coolest characters in V, The Final Battle. But it seems like this movie just went through a lot of different variations, and it never really found its tone. Because like you said, John, sometimes it's like a riff, but it's not as tongue-in-cheek as Ice Pirates. And then it's also not as serious as Star Wars, or even as like exploitation heavy as like Star Crash, where it's more like Corman level type, like scantily clad women. And you're kind of going for that. This movie at times, like, it tries to kind of be a little straight-laced, especially when it comes to the threats, the villains. And then other times it's goofy.
Yeah. And going back to the 80s, I mean, we've talked a lot about how it's just a completely different generation. Things were, accepted back then, which would be a little bit tougher to pull off in a movie now. But like you said, Bernie, one of the interesting things is when the three ladies land on the planet, we've seen so many movies from the 80s where they would pop out of their spacecraft and be scantily clad, and you would go right into like a sexploitation type film. And they didn't do that in this. So you're thinking, all right, well, these are pretty ladies, but like they're going to try to do something serious here. And then fast forward a bit where Molly Ringwald comes on screen. And to me, I start feeling this like weird romancing the stone tension between the main character and Molly Ringwald, where they like hate each other, but they probably love each other. And there is a scene where Molly Ringwald is, well, I should probably set the tone that or set the story that, she's just kind of this brat, right? I mean, she is just full on brat. And he's the I'm going to teach you where it's at. And, I'm not even going to really listen to what you're saying. I'll let you blow off some steam and then I'll show you where it's at. But then she's super dirty in rags. And they wind up around this puddle and he pulls out shampoo from his front pocket and gives her, as our friend, I got to give Alan, our friend Alan, props here. He called it kind of the mommy dearest bathing scene, where the main character literally is almost bathing the brattiness.
Maybe the only time in cinematic history where you can get something like "mommy dearest" in the same sentence as Spacehunter. But sorry, no, absolutely, John, absolutely right. Yes.
So it's he's bathing the brattiness out of her. I'm going to show you and I'm going to make you a respectable girl. And then, her nice orange and red highlights come out of her hair. But that's I'm a little uncomfortable about their relationship. So I wanted to ask you guys, when you were first watching this film, or Pete, even just this recent time, because you probably didn't remember back, what did you think about their relationship first 10 minutes or so as they were interacting? Because maybe I just completely misread this.
I was hoping that it was going to be a father-daughter relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy that seems to have been the case, but going through my brain again, not remembering everything about it and knowing that I've seen plenty of older Hollywood movies where you've got leading man is 50, 60 years old, mm-hmm. and his love interest is, 22, 23. So it's not like it has not been shoehorned into a story in the past here. I'm really hoping that they don't do this. To their credit, they did not. So that was good. But I think if you're going in cold and you're again, having grown up on some of those movies, you would certainly be, you'd certainly be thinking oh my God, they're going to make these two become romantically involved at some point. And there's weird, like you were saying, John, there's a couple of weird scenes where he's got this shiny Jiffy Pop sleeping bag, and
that's right.
And she's
that's my favorite prop in the movie, by the way.
Because shiny silvery thing equals space, so we're in space. Yay!
That's right. It's funny because they never go full creep zone to take from the movie's original title, but they certainly teeter on the edge, because that sleeping bag scene and just certain moments where they're together, where I just kept leaning in psychologically and emotionally, being please don't do this. Just keep it as a father-daughter relationship. And even at the end, to be fair to the movie, they do keep it that way, where he's well, if you want to go to another planet, I'll take you, even though he kind of pushes her away because he's the loner, he's the Han Solo type character, he's the rogue, right? But he does take her in and realize that he does have a heart and he can be this father figure. But there are some times where it kind of teeters on the edge of, please do not share a sleeping bag. I don't think my eyes can take it in 2D or 3D.
So we were joking about this throughout. And this is one of the things early that I was oh no. And everybody else was oh no about the effects. And I was oh no about this, because I love Romancing the Stone. And I love some of those movies, again, where you have we hate each other because we love each other kind of stuff. And this went on. So you guys are giving this movie a lot of credit, because this went on for the whole movie until the very, very end, when they have the hug that's more platonic, more father-daughter. But it continues. So I'm just the
you had this tension Bernie. Balloon the whole time.
So, and balloon is a great term, because I kept calling it the Jiffy Pop sleeping bag, because the silvery Jiffy Pop sleeping bag Molly Ringwald carries around for 20 minutes in this movie. And they keep going place to place. The main character sleeps in this thing to begin with. And it's kind of that Romancing the Stone, I'll be fine in here, you go do your thing, and whatever. And then there is a cut to them sleeping in the same bed together with the Jiffy Pop over them. And they're spooning. And again, if you look at it as a father-daughter, it's nothing. But if you don't, it's something. And I was not looking at it as a father-daughter at that point. And I like almost fell off the couch because I was so grossed out by that scene.
Well, I will say the one thing that the movie doesn't do, and this may be a little short shrift for Spacehunter, The Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, because I can only help to compare it to Metalstorm. And since Pete and I spent way more time talking about Metalstorm than we probably planned on, and we'll probably talk about Spacehunter longer than we would want to, but at least in comparison to the two movies, Metalstorm, The Destruction of Jared-Syn, does a very good job of keeping like these broad strokes where you have the rogue and another rogue in Tim Thomerson, because if you have one Han Solo, you should have two. The damsel in distress, the villain who's just a villain in Jared-Syn, who, mind you, is so villainous he never gets destroyed, even though that's the namesake of the movie, right? In this movie, you kind of get all the broad strokes too. The rogue, the sidekick in Ernie Hudson, the villains are certainly villainous looking, at least, and even sounding to that point. Molly Ringwald as this sort of like Robin type character. But when they get rid of Chalmers, like there's a way where I was always expecting, again, rewatching the movie, where is the love interest? Because I don't want it to come from Molly Ringwald. Like I was hoping that those Amazon type women, like that tribe in the zone that they encounter, that make like a throwaway comment, like about Wolf's character. Oh, like you look healthy enough to breed, and he's just like, oh, like I would do that. That's fine, like, oh, I bet you're good enough to breed.
Just lost my sex robot. I'm ready.
Yeah, but in some ways, like I think John, you would have liked sexy C-3PO to survive, because that would have deflated the tension balloon that you had. Because at least with Chalmers, whether or not, he was taking advantage of her or she was programmed, I don't know. I don't want to get into robot ethics on this.
Yeah, she's an adult robot.
But at least it's an adult, and it feels like that's okay. And like then Chalmers and Wolf and Nikki can be a nice little family unit, and they have Uncle Washington and played by Ernie Hudson who shows up. Like that's what you want. Not like
Ernie looking back, he was acting like he was in love with Chalmers.
Yes. Well, again, you get the flirty banter between the two of them that feels age appropriate. Well, these two are partners, and then when it's like he even makes the comment, like, "I bought you the sexy shirt," like that was worth the investment.
Yes,
this was kind of like this made me laugh out loud when she gets deprogrammed, destroyed, shot. When during that big train sail barge sequence, he thinks he doesn't see it, so he comes back to the buggy and he's like, Chalmers, we gotta get moving, we gotta get blah blah. And then he notices that she's been shot, and then you do like the tilt of the head, so you see that oh my god, she's a robot. Oh, unbelievable, can't believe that. And then this cold motherfucker, like he just gets in the fucking buggy, presses a button, and melts the thing down.
That's a good point, Pete, because like in any other movie, maybe the movie we all wanted to see, doesn't he like take the parts of her, put her in the
able
vehicle?
To repair her.
Yeah, that would make more sense. Yeah,
something like show some emotion. He showed the emotional capacity of like a rock at the bottom of the ocean. Like I don't like. There are multiple scenes where he should be reacting or showing strong emotion, and he shows none. And I get, they played him as this Han Solo, like unfeeling, stoic type, and I get that, but like he just doesn't show any emotion in any of the really important scenes.
He had like the polar opposite level of charisma of Harrison Ford, though. I think that was like one of the problems. And I don't mean that to be necessarily a huge criticism of Peter Strauss. Like the guy did a ton of work. I think he did a ton of TV movies, but he's just
the writing.
Like he's almost playing it too straight. Like this is a movie made for chewing some scenery. Like Ernie Hudson chews some scenery, Michael Ironside chews some scenery, Molly Ringwald's doing the best she can with like a really shitty script and comes across as like way too whiny than I think her character should be. But like she's at least, she's putting in the work. And I think Peter Strauss, I don't know if he just didn't quite know like what to do with that character, but he was just kind of like flatline like the whole movie. There's just not a whole lot of even like his like you were mentioning, like the one-liners of like when the women are like, "Oh, we need, you're good for breeding." Is like, "Oh, I'll do that." Or like later on, he's like, "I'll take that bet," or something. Like even his one-liners are just kind of like, whatever.
The writing and directing is so poor that you're looking at these actors you start to realize how important the writing and the direction are. And I feel like, and I'm not saying either the writer stinks or the director stinks, but clearly they're not on the same page. And maybe it was the directing change that also impacted this. But like you said, like Ernie's trying, you could tell.
Well, I think this goes back to Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, where Pete, you and I were talking about how Jeffrey Byron is Dogen. He lacks charisma. Same with Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, where we're watching Tim Thomerson. It's like, he should have been the lead because he seems to understand, like, and then you watch this and I'm like, yeah, you know what? Ernie Hudson probably understood what this movie was. He should have been the lead. And maybe Peter Strauss should have been more like the straight-laced bounty hunter, police officer, whatever it is, because at least Ernie Hudson had a little bit of a wink to the camera to realize I kind of know the production I'm in. And I feel like, you know, what we saw him do, like you said earlier, John, 2 years later in Ghostbusters, it seems like he had the capacity to give us the goofiness that this was missing.
He's the one who seems to get what's going on. And I did want to ask you guys too, because at 20 minutes, battles have happened, journeys have happened, and I joked around that the whole crew had only moved about 10 square feet in the movie in 20 minutes. But at about 40 minutes, we had a commercial break and we came back and we were all like, does anybody know what's happening? And then as we moved forward, that's when they started introducing the first bad guy. And I thought he was like Pete said, I thought he was the main bad guy because it was so late in the film and he was so creepy that I was like, this must be, you know, the main villain.
And completely underused. And underused because as you get on Michael Ironside, and you know, I mean, I remember him again from like V the Final Battle. I know he was in Total Recall and Top Gun for like a few minutes. He definitely chewed the scenery in Highlander 2, but it feels like under all the makeup and he's kind of like behind this case kind of thing that I couldn't describe, but it looked kind of cool. Like it looked like there was
describe it, Ernie. I'll describe
please.
Yeah, have you guys seen, before you describe it, Pete, have you guys seen Dark City at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay. He kind of reminded me of some of like the Clocker, you know, like.
Again, Mommy Dearest and Dark City in the same podcast episode as Spacehunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, where the forbidden adventure is clarity and or quality. But Pete, you were going to say.
So describe that.
So Overdog's look, the best way I can describe it without you seeing an image of it, listeners, is he's like a human skill crane in a case that rather than filled with like plush stuffed animals, it's filled with used sex toys.
Do not shy away from the fact that he's attached almost to a podium.
Yes.
And it's like an elevated thing. So he's constantly like part of some like mechanical elevated, like, you know, flying machine thing. He also has right in front of him what looks to me like a parking meter, because we were joking about usage.
Oh,
they took every prop and piece of everything from the junkyards and everywhere and tried to put it in every single scene.
It's a missed opportunity because with all the unpaid parking tickets that Wolf had, if he had some of his mega credits, he could have just slipped it into Michael Ironside's belly button, and then he might have been able to pay off some of his debts.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
I've got a question for you guys, and I don't know if you caught this, or Bernie, maybe you have some more insight on this, because I sure as hell don't. But
I can't imagine how I could, but please.
So when I first rewatched this a couple of weeks ago, and then we watched it again last night with Alan and Rebecca, John and I, you know, two of our other esteemed guests on here on Fan2Fan. So when I watched it a couple of weeks ago, like, and I saw it again, I feel like there's almost like an interesting origin story of like the villains, because it's almost like a blink and you'll miss it. When Wolf is on his ship at the very beginning, there's a screen that comes up with Michael Ironside, sans makeup, his face, and two other guys, and it's like Captain something is under his headshot.
You know, and because don't they don't they throw away the comment that like there was a colony on that planet? Okay.
Something like that. Yeah. So like they went down to the planet and like no one heard from them again. And so this is him and his toady is clearly one of the other guys, but like how they went from normal humans to these fucked up bad guys, I'm like that could be an interesting story, but like you get no exposition about it. Like it's just now all of a sudden Michael Ironside is a human skill crane. He's got like these giant claw things. He's hooked up to the thing. He's got no legs. He's just getting swung around. Like how does that happen? Like how,
well, and then I said to our friends, because there was that 1 second, you try to use a little bit too much common sense with some of these films. So I was like, why don't they just leave? Because like Ironsides is hooked up to this like crane. You're like, he can't really get to anybody. He's just kind of levitating. And then of course, I was proven wrong 2 seconds later when he just starts shooting lasers out of his like claw hands.
You're right, John. Though he's literally like he is at the mercy of everyone else in that in that lair to like kind of do all the things that he needs. Like he starts out like he's in some like glass casing or something like that when he's first introduced. And again, this is literally like halfway through the movie. So I think one of the big issues with this and why it it's just not very good, is like the pacing is so off. And then you're introducing like your main bad guy halfway through, but then all this other stuff has happened. Like they're essentially going from like set piece to set piece. And it's like, oh, here's us in the water part of the planet. Here's us where like these disgusting, like bloated, bald baby creature things come sliding out of chute. Like it was just like,
yep.
They just kind of go from like place to place very slowly, like John was saying.
Yeah, it's just like genre soup, right? Like they're checking everything off. Let's run into the Amazonian tribe. Let's never actually do anything with these, because the whole time you're watching this movie, and for anyone who's listened this far, one, I mean, really, thank you. But two, you probably get where we're all coming from, because we all grew up watching the same thing. So it feels like this movie, if it made these small little pivots where we needed Michael Ironside's character to do a little bit more monologuing, because like you said, Pete, felt like there was an origin there. He's alone on this planet. They've kind of figured out how to survive. He's put a bunch of people in this zone. Seems like he has these mazes to entertain the masses and like ingratiate himself with them. So there seems like there's some simple things there. The Amazonian women, the random trio of other like Mad Max type bikers that are just there, and it seems like they lose their father at one point early on in this battle, and again never kind of half baked, but everything just keeps moving towards this place where you're like, yeah, this is now the scene where our character Wolf rallies everyone together, right? And there's like a big rebellion, and maybe Nikki kind of comes into her own, and instead of being like this brat, it turns out that she's like the rebel leader, and she's going to become our like, it's just, all right, movie, do that. And then you would at least be a little less banal. That was great word used, John, because it's in some ways it makes it so forgettable, because it's like, yeah, you got all the pieces there, but you didn't put them in the right order. And a lot of them were never fully fleshed out, where it's like, okay, and now are you going to do the cool scene with Ernie Hudson? No, you're just going to waste them. Well, this sucks.
Yeah. Giant claws, even just a little bit about like why he became this sort of mechanized, being. Like you don't have to do a whole backstory, but even like give me a little something about his anger and about why he's this almost like, half robot, so almost like being
and I have to wonder though, like seeing that this director Lamont Johnson had directed, mostly for TV, and again, if this is like a stretch for him on a scale factor, right? Like this is a much bigger movie, a much bigger production that he's used to. I think the difference between this and Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, might be Charles Band. Because there's something about Band that really leans into Lloyd Kaufman, Roger Corman style production, where he seems to do the earnest awfulness, where you're trying to make a good movie, but when you realize you can't, it doesn't mean you make a bad movie. You still make the best movie you can, and then we end up enjoying it, but we have fun watching it, versus this, where you got to wonder, like, is this guy trying to actually make a Star Wars instead of realizing that he can't make Star Wars? So maybe what you do is you make Star Crash or Ice Pirates or Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, because that's actually probably what you can get away with the cast, the production quality, the budget that you have to work with. So do that, And then on top of it, it's in 3D. Like, we haven't even talked about that when we had, I think we devoted 60 minutes to that, Pete, where we went through Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. All these moments where a sigh is being lunged at your face and green acid and ooze is being thrown. It's like, yeah, you could tell if you were in the theater, and you were, Pete, this was made for you as a kid. Enjoy the 3D classes. This is what you paid for. This, it's kind of forgettable from the 3D front, let alone a lot of other parts of this movie.
There were one or two moments that had like an Ed Wood feel to me, like, because I was trying to think of it.
No need to insult Ed Wood now.
I know, and I was not watching it. I wasn't watching it in 3D, but I love 3D films, and I wish it was available in like just the old anaglyph 3D, because I'd love to watch it in that format. Although I don't know, it may have been in the more like the gray glass format. I'm not sure, but there were a couple parts with just like planets and things you could see that they did like a layered dimension, almost like a, your Viewmaster kind of thing.
No need to insult Viewmaster now, John.
Yeah, either way. But it just fell so short on that. And I feel like they had a lot of talent in this movie. And my guess is that's Ivan Reitman's doing. I don't even know. I have no idea. But, you turn around just 1 year, 1.5 years, and you have two of these stars in the biggest movies in America.
And you mentioned, John, earlier, like Molly Ringwald, obviously Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, 16 Candles, all the John Hughes stuff. Had she done one of those before this?
I don't think so. I think this is like after Facts of Life and before, right before. So Reitman somehow, or somebody, sees her talent for real, sees Hudson, who, Reitman is Ghostbusters, so that makes more sense. But somebody sees Ringwald in this, and they're like, this is sad, because again, I was mentioning before the writing and the directing. Molly Ringwald's a great actress. Ironside's a good actor. Ernie Hudson's a good actor. There's probably other people in this movie that are good actors that just don't come across that way. But Molly Ringwald, somebody looks at her and they're like, yeah, she's what I need. And it's hard to watch her in this movie. She's such a brat. And she's trying, because she's trying to make something big out of a script that's just not really good. So she's trying to make this character like really annoying intentionally, you could tell. And it works, but not for the movie. It just works as like getting under your skin.
It may be Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, but there are a few other things forbidden in this movie where it's like a decent script, plot, pacing, and character development were also, I think, forbidden. But I think her character, especially, I think,
and adventure, Pete, and adventure.
No adventure will be had during the entire runtime of this movie. Her character, I think, just gets completely underserved, because I'm looking at the poster for the movie, and there's like, of course, they've got like the little teaser type, leading it like Wolf and Nikki. He's an interstellar adventurer. She's a young rebel. It's like, okay, there's nothing young rebel about her in this movie. And if they had made her like that, then that's, I think, like you were talking about, Bernie, like if she becomes like the leader of some like resistance on the planet, like that, okay, though, there's some interesting places that you can go with her as a character, but she's just, like John said, like whiny damsel in distress. She's like crying because she just, she finds out her father is killed, but like it happens like, off screen and before like we even show up in the movie. And so she's like, I got to get off this planet. But like she's clearly been surviving on her own for a while. So you would think like that she can take care of herself, but she just comes across as like there's the number of scenes where she's like crying or like she's like turning away to like hide the tears and stuff like that. It's like there is a decent character to be had for. And again, I think we're doing way more analysis of this movie than it deserves. But like when you're looking at it from a lens in 2023, you're like, oh, okay. So if someone was making this now, like there's some very obvious, small things that could be done that would have made this movie at least 2 to 3 times better.
I think the insult to injury on Molly Ringwald too is whether this was her decision or the director's decision, but the random vernacular that she throws in, the movie is pretty one note for the most part, and the note being not fun. But right. The thing that she does where if she's not already being a brat and annoying, then she throws in this like random stuff that I have to imagine if I'm her, because we know in the future that she's actually a pretty good actress. Right. So you just have to wonder, is this like youth or is this just poor direction? Bad script that gets almost tossed out, if Wikipedia is to be believed, that is this just her maybe realizing that there's not much to this character and maybe that's the most she can bring to it, is this sort of like annoying slang that might bring at least a layer of character development to her? Because it totally does a disservice to her, and we're talking about this movie with way more credit than it deserves. For anyone listening, not at all worthy of all this.
If it didn't have, let's say it just had Ernie Hudson and nobody else we had ever heard of, then you might be
talking like the one-man production that Ernie Hudson does still in LA for his
one-man production of Spacehunter, My Adventure in the Forbidden Zone,
where he plays all the parts
on
John?
stage.
Is that what you're talking?
Yeah, but just there's an odd amount of talent in this film, which also just is like antithetical to like when you're watching and you're like,
I'll tell you, for me, by no means am I saying that Metalstorm and the Destruction of Jared-Syn is a good movie, because it is not. So I just want to preface that. But what I enjoyed about watching that, and Bernie, our conversation about that and why we talked about it for so long, because there's a fun element to it that's missing here. And I'll point to specifically to a scene like at the very beginning of Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn. Dojin's driving his beat up vehicle that looks like it's about to fall apart. So right off the bat, that's pretty fucking hysterical. And the way that it's edited is that he's driving along and then he stops, slides back the window, takes his helmet off, and just like stares out into the sky. And then the next scene is him driving again. Like there is no point to that scene other than to just see the guy's face. But there's other ways you could do that. But the way that it's edited, I'm like, oh my God, this is hysterical. And because that's a conscious choice. And so there's so many scenes in Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn like that, where you just kind of like, what the hell is going on here? Why are they doing this? But it makes it fun. The closest I thought that Spacehunter comes is, again, it's at the end of that scene at the beginning with the raid on that train barge thing. The scene is basically over, and you've got this like high, wide shot looking down on it, and you see Wolf's buggy starting to move off, and you've got like this rousing score by, I think Elmer Bernstein did the score, and it just, the score is kind of like it's trying to get you excited for stuff that's not really happening on screen. Right, and so this is like the perfect scene, because the score is like this rousing thing of like, oh my God, can you believe the adventure that was just happened in the scene? And the buggy is slowly moving off screen and it just lingers. And I'm like, this should have just been cut like 30 seconds ago. But that gave me the same feeling that I got throughout Metalstorm, the Destruction of Jared-Syn, which is why for me, that is a much more enjoyable watch than this, which is just, there's just not much going on. Like stuff happens, but I'll tell
you what does happen when that buggy comes up the first time. And I don't know why I caught this. I was probably the only person watching the screen at this moment, but the buggy takes an actual leak on the, in the sand. You go back, Bernie, when you get a chance. And
I don't want to.
You have to. The opening scene, the buggy pulls up, stops, and the buggy itself takes a leak on. And I think that's like perfect.
That maybe, because this is the fun thing about doing a bunch of 3D movies. And I think, Pete, you may agree, it's kind of cool because we grew up with this craze. And I think, to be fair, like there were some good theater movies, but I think when it became like an event on TV, and a lot of those movies were not necessarily good movies, but in the comfort of your own home with 3D glasses on, that makes a movie that's not good great. It makes exciting. It kind of fun and exciting to watch 100% versus something like this, where again, it checks everything for a young Pete into theater. But I think this is where, compared to, and again, this is providing way more context to the movie than it deserves, but you think like Star Wars, maybe it's Lucas's like actual affinity for Commander Cody and all those like space pulp adventures, like Flash Gordon, the original ones, that he tries to translate that to the screen, but with really, really heightened levels of effects and an actual kind of like plot that tries to be maybe more than what you expect it to be, especially maybe in 1977, where you're just thinking, I don't know what this Star Wars is, but like I'll give it a shot. And then you walk out thinking, wow, there's an actual character arc. And maybe by courtesy of, Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, that kind of layers in some universal truths in there, versus this, where it feels like a copy of a copy. Like it doesn't have its own identity, but it's also not Star Wars, but it's trying to be Star Wars, but it certainly doesn't pull it off. That's maybe the most disappointing part, is that the cast is there, like you said, John, better than you expect it to be. The movie, I don't know if it would have been served with more driving scenes, like Metalstorm: The Destruction of Jared-Syn, that has a 93-minute runtime, and I think, Pete, 33 minutes of that may just be driving from place to place. It's just kind of disappointing because, it makes a movie like Metalstorm: The Destruction of Jared-Syn that much more fun to rewatch. I want to rewatch that before I would want to rewatch Spacehunter.
Yeah, this one. It's just not a lot of fun, and I don't know if that's because people weren't leaning into chewing the scenery enough, or it kind of just wanders aimlessly. And I think because it's so disjointed, where there's basic story beats that are either missing, or they're moved so far further into the movie that you're, like John was saying, you're just completely lost. You don't know what. Kept asking myself, what the hell is even going on here? One of the most enjoyable thing about watching it the other night was when
it ended.
was when it ended. Yes, exactly. When that first closing credit came up, I was like, oh, thank God. No, so John, Alan, and I are watching, and then Alan's wife Rebecca comes on literally halfway through the movie, and she's like, oh, okay, and she's like, what the hell? She kept saying, what the hell is happening? And we're shrugging our shoulders, you really came into the perfect time, because we don't have any more information for you than you're getting in real time.
I know, 40 something minutes into a movie, and we almost didn't have anything to tell her for backstory.
Mm-hmm. It did find some success on home video. It was the 10th best-selling video cassette in 1983, which, to be fair, and I think this is where context is king, we all grew up in our mom and pop video stores. The selections were pretty anemic at that time. Maybe in 1983, where the options are kind of slim, I can see how Spacehunter can break into the top 10. So I will give it that.
And it was rated PG, so that, I think, if you're going to your local video store, if you go to your local video store, and if they have any strict rules against kids renting rated R movies, then that was an easy bet to pluck off the shelf. So I imagine that probably helped in its cracking the top 10 of video sales for 1983.
Well, and I'll leave you guys with this. Ice Pirates was a bad movie, but when you're a little kid, it was ideal. It was just so stupid. But it's like Citizen Kane compared to this. Looking back, you're that was a bad movie. And then you're wow, that was a really good movie compared to this movie.
That's where we end the episode right there. That's it. That was awesome.
So when you're coming in under space herpes, then you've got some explaining to do.